Hello, and welcome to this presentation called First Steps in Clause Analysis, Finding the Verb. My name is Jodie, and I'm Senior Lecturer in English Language at Sheffield Hallam University. You may have met me previously in the presentation called First Steps in Clause Analysis, Finding the Subject. So if you are interested in that, would like to go one step further to the next thing, which is to find the verb in a clause, this is the presentation for you. And if you haven't watched that presentation, give this one a try anyway and see if you can follow along. Now, in the last presentation, we were talking about clauses, and we were talking about the structural aspects of a language that your brain has known since at least the time you were 3, but probably prior to that. And we talked about how a clause has two essential elements, a subject and a verb, and your brain already knows how to find them, and it knew that before it had even heard the words subject and verb. And we will have a quick review of how to find the subject, and then we'll move on to verbs. So we use something called the question tag probe, which I just adore. And a probe is a way of using a kind of like imaginary claw to seek into what your brain already knows just by virtue of being so good at language and pulling out particular elements that we can look at once we have a little bit of terminology. So we use the question tag probe to help us find subjects of clauses. So let's review how you've done. Let's see if you can remember how to use a question tag probe to find the subject of this clause. And the clause is, despite all our misgivings, my accident-prone sister is dancing the salsa in the kitchen again. So take a second and see if you can find the subject of that clause. So you can pause the presentation if necessary. And now let's have a look at how you would do it using the question tag probe. So the first thing you do is you add a question tag to that. So, despite all our misgivings, my accident-prone sister is dancing the salsa in the kitchen again, isn't she? And then what you do is you take the subject pronoun, which is the final word in the question tag. You find that. And then you check in the clause to see what she could replace. So you take the whole phrase that you could replace with she. So, despite all our misgivings, she is dancing the salsa in the kitchen again, and that could replace the whole phrase, my accident-prone sister. And so then you know that the thing that she replaces, my accident-prone sister, is the subject. It's the noun phrase that's the subject of the clause. Okay, so hopefully you did fine with that. If you didn't, you might need a little bit of a review. You can go back to that first presentation, or you can just keep following along. Okay, so our brain is asking, our very smart brain is asking, well, what about the actual verb? If we can use the question tag probe to find the subject, how do we find the verb? Well, we can use, first of all, we're looking for the verb that agrees with the subject. So we're not just looking at a sentence and homing in on whatever verbs we can find. We're looking for a specific verb. It's called the verb element, and it's the one that agrees with the subject. Now, I'm not going to give you a whole lot of terminology about what subject-verb agreement is. You might already have some ideas about that. But for now, just keep that in the back of that smart brain and realize that we're looking for this notion of agreement. The subject and the verb go together in some way. And then if you and I ever have a chance to meet up, which I hope we do, I'll tell you, well, we can talk a bit more about what that agreement actually entails. So what we'll do in order to explore the business of the verb element is just have a look at this story, which might have a sort of familiar tone to it. I'm not answering my phone. My boss has been ringing all day. She's asking me to cover for Ali again. I covered Ali's shift yesterday, so she can forget about me doing it today. Okay, so hopefully you haven't been having this kind of conversation or non-conversation with your boss. So what I'm going to do is just ask you off the top of your head, it doesn't matter if you don't quite get it yet, but can you find the verb element? Can you find the bit that agrees with the subject? You say to me, well, no, because you told me you were going to tell me how to do that, but you might already know it. So if you already know it, let's give you the kudos for knowing it. What I'll do is I'll give you the first one. I'm not answering my phone. The verb element there is am not answering. So what we realize there is the verb element can contain more than one word. And it can also contain the word not, but that's where we are with that. So with knowing what the answer to the first one is, see if you can find the verb element for the other 4. And I'm about to give you the answer, so if you're not finished, pause it. And there's the answers. Has been ringing, is asking, covered, and can forget. So these are sort of vaguely what verb elements might look like. We realize they can contain more than one word. They might not contain more than one word. And that's where we are. So here's the thing. What happens when we want to actually find them, when we don't know the answer? Well, the beauty of the question tag probe is that you can use it to find the verb as well as the subject. So the question tag probe works brilliantly for both. So what we want to do now is we want to come up with a question tag for each of those clauses in this little story. So I'm not answering the phone. I'm not answering my phone, am I? Right, there's our question tag. And we want to really spend some time with the question tag. We want to make sure we get the question tag right, because that's going to be our pointer to all the rest of it. My boss has been ringing all day, hasn't she? She's asking me to cover for Ollie again, isn't she? But I covered Ollie's shift yesterday, didn't I? So she can forget about me doing it again, can't she? Okay. So what I'd like you to do now is have a look at the question tags and have a look at the actual verb element of the clauses and see if you notice anything about them. See if you can notice any patterns. And one of the patterns that you might notice is that the first word in the tag matches, in most instances, the first word in the verb element, right? So am I, am not answering. Hasn't she, has been ringing. Isn't she, is asking. And can't she, can forget. Right? So that first word matches the first word in the verb element. So we're already getting a sense that, okay, this could actually be really quite valuable for us. Now you might have noticed that there's one for which that doesn't work. So, but I covered Ollie's shift yesterday, didn't I? And there's no did in the clause, but I covered Ollie's shift yesterday. So this one doesn't work in the same way. But we will discuss how this one works. You might already have a few ideas already. But if not, we'll get to that in a bit later. What's happening is that the first word in the question tag, if we get rid of our negative particle, our nt, which is a contraction for not, that first word is always an auxiliary of one sort or another. It's an auxiliary, and our verb element can also contain auxiliaries. So let's have a look at what our verb element can contain. Those are some of the auxiliaries in the verb element: am, has, is, and can, and we also see those as part of question tags. So a verb element can contain auxiliaries, and it also contains or can contain lexical verbs. So auxiliaries are what are called function words or grammar words. You can think of them as being words that have a function or a purpose in the clause, but are actually quite tricky to describe or define, or if you saw them, if you were asked to act out the word am in a game of charades, you would probably struggle with it. But if you had to act out the word answering or answer, you'd probably be able to do that. You'd be like, right? So the lexical verbs are verbs that can be described or defined. We can come up with a synonym of them. We can act them out. You know, you could say, oh, answering. Answering means like when you respond to something. Or ringing, that's when you go bring, you know, or asking is like when you have a question. So lexical verbs are ones that you can define. Whereas auxiliaries have a function, but they're a lot trickier to define. Okay? So we're noticing that our verb elements can have auxiliaries, and they also can have lexical verbs. Okay, and we can also notice that, like with has been ringing, they have more than one auxiliary. Has is an auxiliary and been is an auxiliary. But the only auxiliary we get in the question tag is the first one, is the has. Yeah? Okay, so let's see how we can put all this to use. So I'm going to give you this list of clauses, sentences, but they're also single clauses. And these are the exact same ones from the previous presentation. They're rearranged a little bit in order of difficulty. And you've already, if you've looked at the first presentation, you've already found the subject. So you might want to go through and see if you can find the subject again based on what you know. But also have a look for the verb element for each. Now I'm going to take you through this step by step, but you might already feel equipped to find the verb element. So if you'd like to pause this and see if you can find the verb element for each of those sentences, each of those clauses, that might be a great place to start. And we'll move on now after you've unpaused, and we'll have a look at how we got on. So if we start with the one about the guinea pigs, my neighbor's prized guinea pigs have found their way into my dad's vegetable patch. So let's take this through step by step how to find the verb element. So the guinea pig will guide us. So the guinea pig says, well, the first thing we do is add a question tag. My neighbor's prized guinea pigs have found their way into my dad's vegetable patch. Haven't they? And then we say, where's the auxiliary? The auxiliary is the first part of the tag. So we put a little circle around that, which is have. And then we look for that same auxiliary in the clause. So it's going to be the same auxiliary as in the question tag. So we look through, scan it. My neighbor's prized guinea pigs have. There's our auxiliary in the clause. And then the next thing we do is we look immediately to the right of the auxiliary in the clause. So effectively we look at the next word. And the next word here is found. So we ask ourselves, is that a lexical verb? Okay, now we know that a lexical verb is one where we can define it or act it out. So if I had to define the word found, I would say, well, finding something, that's like when you're looking for it and then its location becomes known to you. Okay, so it's like, okay, I can define it. Is it a verb? Well, let's see if it acts like a verb. I find, you find, I found. Yeah, you can mark it for tense. Yeah, I am finding. Yeah, it sounds like a verb to me. Okay, so we'll say, look, that is a lexical verb, and the guinea pig says, stop there. Once you get to the lexical verb, stop. You've found the verb element. Okay, so here we've got have, found together is our verb element. And now we can just check, we can add that to what the subject is. My neighbor's prized guinea pigs have found their way into my dad's vegetable patch. Haven't they? They replaces my neighbor's prized guinea pigs. That's the subject. And then if we wanted to make a little chart, we have a nice subject, my neighbor's prized guinea pigs, verb element have found. And once you've found the subject and the verb element of a clause, everything else just kind of gets taken care of for you. It's like doing a crossword puzzle where you find most of the letters. Everything else just falls into place. So let's try it again. Okay, let's do this one about the chinchilla. Despite all his protests, my cousin Mo really does enjoy looking after my chinchillas, so we add our question tag. Despite all his protests, my cousin Mo really does enjoy looking after my chinchillas, doesn't he? And then we look for the auxiliary, so the first word in the question tag, which is does. And then we check the original clause to find the exact same auxiliary. Despite all his protests, my cousin Mo really does. Oh, there it is. We got it. And then we look to the word to the right. Check that out. It's the word enjoy. We say, is it a lexical verb? Okay, well, I can define it. When you enjoy something, that means you like it a lot. So I can define it. Does it act like a verb? I am enjoying. You have enjoyed. Yeah, acts like a verb. Therefore, it is a lexical verb. And I know that I can stop there. I've found my verb element. Does enjoy. Okay, and then we can add our subject to that. We know the subject is my cousin Mo. Did that before. And then we've got our little chart. My cousin Mo does enjoy. And what you've done there is you've just isolated the most important parts of the clause. And if later you want to analyze more of that clause, the rest of it will just fall into place, promise. After school, Lucy and I are going to the cinema. We add our question tag. After school, Lucy and I are going to the cinema. Aren't we? We look for our auxiliary in the tag, which is the first word in the tag, which is are. We look for the same auxiliary in the sentence. There it is. We look to the word to the right of the auxiliary, which is going. We ask if it's a lexical verb. Well, I can define it. Going means you move from one place to another. Is it a verb? Yeah, it feels like a verb. It's got ing at the end. I go, you go, he goes. We're all going. Yep, feels like a verb. So it is a verb. It's a lexical verb. We stop. We realize we've got the verb element. Then we add the subject, which is Lucy and I. And we've got the two essential parts of that clause right there. Lucy and I is the subject, and are going is the verb element. You're doing brilliantly. Okay, Miriam's love of salted caramel gherkins has caused her to go up in my opinion. We add the question tag, hasn't it? We check the auxiliary in the question tag, which is has. We look for the same auxiliary in the original clause, and we find it there. We look to the right of that and we see the word caused. We ask ourselves, is it a lexical verb? Well, I can define it. So to cause something means to bring it about. And is it a verb? Well, it seems like it's a verb. It's got an id at the end of it. And you could say it causes, I've caused, you are causing. Feels like a verb. Okay, so that's our lexical verb. I stop. My verb element is has caused. And we can add the subject to that, which is Miriam's love of salted caramel gherkins. And we've got both elements of the clause. Miriam's love of salted caramel gherkins is the subject, and the verb element is has caused. So we are amazing. Our brains are very smart. We have figured out all of these things. We've looked at all of those sentences, which seemed kind of elaborate at the beginning, and we've managed to find the subject and the verb element by using that question tag probe. And if you just wanted to check your work, those are the answers there, your subject and your verb element for each of those clauses. And once you've got those, as I said, if you wanted to do more analysis, everything else kind of falls into place once you've got those two components. So if you got that far and you understood those, you did absolutely fantastically well. You can stop there and feel happy with yourself, but you might want to look at a couple of some slightly more challenging ones. So these last two are a little bit more challenging. So if you're interested in those, you can continue on with me. And if you're happy that you did such a great job with finding the subject and the verb for the previous ones, you can just stop there. So we'll continue on now and have a look at she will never understand the importance of a good pair of unicorn slippers, and my extremely annoying little sister always gets her way. So let's start with she will never understand the importance of a good pair of unicorn slippers, and we're finding the verb element. So we add our question tag. She will never understand the importance of a good pair of unicorn slippers, will she? We find the auxiliary in the tag. So far, so good. We've got will. We look for the auxiliary in the clause. And we find it straight away. She will. And then we do our classic thing. We look to the right of the auxiliary in the clause. And we get the word never. And then we ask ourselves the question, is it a lexical verb? Okay, so never, I can define it. Never means like not ever, okay. But is it an actual verb? We say, well, I am nevering, she nevered, yesterday she nevered. It doesn't really work like that. It doesn't feel like a verb. And the answer is it isn't a verb. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it isn't a verb. In case you're wondering, it's an adverb. But the main thing here is just to find out whether it's a lexical verb. And the answer is it isn't. So what do we do now? Well, we check to see if it's another auxiliary. Okay, so auxiliaries are like will have been, she never will, she will have been understood, she has been, it's words like that. And this one isn't actually another auxiliary. So we say, okay, well then, so it's not another auxiliary. Now, another thing that can go into a verb element is the negative particle. So the word not or unt. So we say, is it not or unt? Well, it's negative, but it isn't actually the word not or the word unt, the contracted form. So the answer to that is also no. So we've answered those three questions. It's not a lexical verb, it's not another auxiliary, and it's not the word not. So we say, leave it out. If it's not an auxiliary, a lexical verb, or the word not, it's not part of the verb element, leave it out, take it away. We don't want it. And we just go to the next word. We look at the word understand, and we ask ourselves if it's a lexical verb. We say, oh, okay, well, understand, I can define it. Understand is when you finally get something, when it finally makes sense to you. And understand, she is understanding, I have understood. Yep, feels like a verb. And as it turns out, yes, it is a lexical verb. And as we know, once you get to the lexical verb, you stop. Okay, so what we're realizing is not everything that comes between the first auxiliary and the lexical verb is necessarily part of the verb element. Other little words can sneak in there, usually adverbs. Okay, so our verb element is will understand, our subject is she, and there we go. Okay. You could have also said she will always understand, and always wouldn't have been part of it. She will unfortunately never understand, and unfortunately and never, both adverbs, wouldn't be part of your verb element. Okay? And then this final one, my extremely annoying younger sister always gets her way. Okay, so we'll go through this again. We do our question tag first. Doesn't she? We do our auxiliary in the question tag, which is does. And then we look for the auxiliary in the clause. And then when we look, my extremely annoying younger sister always gets her way. There is no auxiliary in the clause. So we said, okay, well, what do we do here? We're expecting to see the auxiliary. We didn't see it. So what we've learned here is that if your tag, if the auxiliary in the tag is do, does, or did, that's told you some important information. It actually tells you something about the aspect of the verb. It tells you the aspect of the verb is simple. Now, there's a bunch of different aspects, well, there's only a few different aspects. One of those aspects is simple, and verbs in the simple aspect don't always require the auxiliary. So if your brain is getting a little bit scrambled, all we need to do is check to see, let's just imagine the sentence again, if it did include the auxiliary. So can you stick a does in there somewhere? So my extremely annoying younger sister always does get her way, right? So it's still in the simple aspect, it's still totally well formed, but we've just chucked a does in there. And what we do is we say, okay, well, if I were looking for the auxiliary, then that would be easy. There's the does. And then I look to the right of it and I see the lexical verb. Is it a lexical verb? Well, yeah, get means when you've wanted something and you finally have it, right? To acquire something. And you say, okay, well, actually, that lexical verb in does get points to the verb element, the simple aspect verb element in that clause. So gets is kind of another way of saying does get, right? And we can talk about why the simple aspect has an auxiliary that doesn't always get used, but we won't talk about that today. We'll talk about that if we ever have a chance to meet, which I hope we do. So gets is the verb element, and the subject is my extremely annoying younger sister. And there we go. There we have those two elements there. So you've now made it this far, which means you've either done this on your own or you've followed along with me. You've found the subject and the verb element of those two clauses, which were a little bit trickier. And there they are, just sort of summed up for you. She is the subject, will understand as the verb element. My extremely annoying younger sister is the subject, and gets is the verb element. So you've done tremendously well. So what I hope you've realized is that the intricacies of clause analysis or any kind of grammatical analysis are always get-atable if we have the right probe, if we can rely upon the information that our brain has stored in there and just allow it to communicate to us in metalinguistic terms, then this stuff is actually a lot easier than you might think. And even if you already found it easy, because some people do, all of this stuff tells us a little bit more about how this information is stored for us and how we can access it. And there's a whole lot more actually that you can learn from question tags and other types of probes. But what's especially interesting about this is once you can do a bit of clause analysis, there's so much more in terms of linguistic analysis that you can do. So I hope I have the chance to tell you a bit more about that. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope I get to meet you someday.